Ladies and gentlemen, this is my great pleasure today and honor to be a special Ukrainian guest speaker at your conference. The conference, which is entitled Security Threats and Challenges East and Southeast Europe. Ukraine has played and is still playing a very important role in the global security order. Today, my country is on the front lines of a renewed great power rivalry that will dominate the international relations in the decades ahead. Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine in 2022 has set alight one of the bloodiest conflicts in Europe since World War II. This invasion marked a dramatic escalation of the 8-year-old conflict between countries, a historic turning point for European security. Ukraine became a battleground in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea and began arming and abetting separatists in the Donbas region in the country's southwest. Russia's seizure of Crimea was the first time since World War II that a European state annexed the territory of another. More than 14,000 people died in the fighting in the Donbas between 2014 and 2021, the bloodiest conflict in Europe since the Balkan Wars of the 1990s. The hostilities marked a clear shift in the global security environment from a unipolar period of United States dominance to a new one, defined by renewed competition between major world powers. Some Western analysts see the main reason of Russia's 2022 invasion as the culmination of the Kremlin's growing resentment toward NATO's post-Cold War expansion into the former Soviet sphere of influence. Other experts have said that perhaps the most important motivating factor for Putin was his fear that Ukraine would continue to develop into a modern Western-style democracy that would inevitably undermine his autocratic regime in Russia and dash his hopes for rebuilding a Russia-led sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. It was always Putin's goal to restore Russia to the status of a great power in northern Eurasia. The end goal was not to recreate the Soviet Union, but to make Russia great again. In this concept, a healthy and stable Ukraine was the main obstacle and critical counterweight to Russia. Former United States National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski once wrote, "It cannot be stressed strongly enough that without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire. But with Ukraine subbound and then subordinated, Russia automatically becomes an empire." Very soon, the ongoing war in Ukraine will complete 10 months, but it is still without any sign of coming to an end. The wish of Ukrainian people is that this aggressive Russian war must end justly and on the basis of an UN Charter and international law, but not somehow. Today, only Ukrainians are paying for their war with their blood, but many people outside of Europe and perhaps the United States appear to have forgotten that the war is still on. Russia has created a huge number of threats. The war unleashed by Putin against Ukraine can comprehensively destabilize the countries of the south and east of Europe. Russia, in this list of threats, has food security, an influx of refugees, rising energy prices, as well as purely military provocations. Never since the end of the World War II has Europe faced so many factors, each of which can have a black swan effect. From the very beginning of the war, Russia began a blockade of Ukrainian ports in which dozens of ships with Ukrainian food were blocked. If not for the collective efforts of the world community in the context of the resumption of supplies of Ukrainian grain, the Russian blockade of ports could seriously affect food security on a number of countries in Africa and Asia. And in this case, Europe would receive a migration tsunami, which in turn would provoke the deepest economic and social crisis in the European Union. Even before the war, Russia began artificially raising energy prices, in particular gas, which is used as an element of bidding and pressure on Europe. The war showed the vulnerability of Europe in terms of energy and dependence on gas and oil supplies from the Russian Federation. If Russia had immediately stopped deliveries of its energy resources to the EU in the dead of winter, the European economy would have collapsed. A lot has been done to diversify gas supplies, and this should be a strategic task for Europe to completely stop buying Russian energy resources. Rising energy prices are driving up prices for goods and services in Europe, which affects small and medium-sized businesses. During this year, the purchasing power of households decreased by almost 7%. Unemployment is rising. People are starting to save on the bare necessities. Governments are allocating less money for social programs. If Europe fails to obtain a stable source of energy at an affordable price, this can bring the real economy to a halt and the collapse of the EU's financial system. In this regard, the euro currency is under the greatest threat, and a number of countries may even leave the EU following the example of the United Kingdom. Putin has committed the biggest encroachment of the territory of sovereign state in the entire 21st century. In Europe, for example, in the Balkans, there are internal problems that can lead to an interstate crisis. Putin immediately destroys the principles of the inviolability of borders, and this may serve as a pretext for repeating such precedents in Europe. Rising prices will inevitably affect scientific research, space programs, government initiatives in the field of ecology. Thus, Russia has created the prerequisites for a perfect storm that will affect all spheres of life in Europe. The EU must concentrate and defeat the Russian challenges. Otherwise, the question of the viability of the European Union as supranational association will inevitably arise, and hence its continued existence. Putin wants to change the existing world order, and Europe is one of his main goals. Therefore, despite all the difficulties and despite all the costs, Europe must emerge victorious from this confrontation. Russia driving negative factors can be called hybrid threats. Sometimes they have a more destructive effect than the direct hostilities. Their influence is latent and long-term, but the ultimate result can be very destructive. Ukraine has presented its vision of the path to peace, known as Ukraine's formula for peace: peace and security for Ukraine, peace and security for Europe, and peace and security for the whole world. President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, presented it to the UN General Assembly and at the G20 summit. This plan is the Ukrainian answer to a whole series of new global challenges provoked by Russian aggression against Ukraine. In this formula, Ukraine introduces a set of solutions that need to be implemented. Among these proposed 10 items, the first one is radiation and nuclear safety. Because of high risk of radioactive disaster, Ukrainian proposal is to send special missions of International Atomic Energy Agency to all Ukrainian plants, to all Ukrainian nuclear plants. Such missions can verify that any hostile activity against Ukrainian nuclear facilities has indeed ceased. The same goes for the crazy threat of nuclear weapons that Russian officials resort to. Next challenge, food security. Ukraine is ready to expand the grain export initiative to other partners. Each country can join the project Grain from Ukraine with a specific contribution and become a co-creator of the victory over hunger and over the food crisis. Third, energy security. These days we can witness an attempt to turn the winter into a weapon against millions of people. More than 50% of our energy infrastructure, plants, transformers, electricity supply lines were destroyed by the strikes of Russian missiles and Iranian drones. Ukraine proposed that a special mission of UN experts is sent to the objects of critical energy infrastructure in order to assess the scope of damage and the needs of restoration. On the other hand, energy resources, gas and oil, must no longer be used as weapons. Price restrictions on Russian energy resources should be introduced. Among other important items in this formula, the release of all prisoners and deportees, implementation of the UN Charter and restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity and the world order, withdrawal of Russian troops and armed formations from the territory of Ukraine, full Ukrainian control over all sections of state border with Russia must be restored. Restoration of justice. The world should endorse establishment of the special tribunal regarding the crime of Russia's aggression against Ukraine and the creation of an international mechanism to compensate for all the damages caused by this war. Such two resolutions of the United Nations General Assembly have been already proposed. Eighth challenge, ecocide. The need for immediate protections of the environment. During the climate summit in Egypt, President of Ukraine proposed a platform to assess the environmental damage of war. This is not just a Ukrainian problem. This is a challenge for the whole world. The next is the prevention of escalation. Ukraine is not a member of any of the alliances. It does not have any security assurances either. That is why Ukraine prepared a draft agreement, the Kyiv Security Compact, and has already presented it to the partners. And the 10th, confirmations of the end of the war under the UN umbrella with the participation of some influential countries. So once again, radiation and nuclear safety, food security, energy security, release of all prisoners and deported persons, implementation and restorations of Ukraine's territorial integrity, withdrawal of Russian troops and cessation of hostilities, restoration of justice, countering ecocide, preventing escalations, and finally, confirmation of the end of the war. The war unleashed by Putin may turn out to be systematic. Ukraine must receive all necessary support because the fate of the whole Europe is being decided on its territory. The time of dictators is running out, and Putin and Lukashenko are a kind of geopolitical relics that have attempted to go back to the past and revive the Soviet totalitarian reality. Putin wants to impose a complex shock on the West in the economy, in the social sphere, in order to deplete its strength. This is a global challenge that the West must accept and win. So the war in Ukraine, to defend its freedom and independence, is also at the same time a war for freedom and democracy, not only in Europe, but in the whole world. Thank you so much for the attention. I once more would like to say thank you to the organizers for inviting me to take part in your conference. I hope this is the first step for closer future cooperation between Ukraine and Serbia, between the Faculty of International Relations of Lviv University with the Institute of Strategic Studies of Serbia. Thank you once more, and see you in Lviv.